Hello, everyone. It's Steve Melito from Go Natural Education here. Today, we're talking to Professor James White of the Department of Plant Biology at Rutgers University. He's the author of more than 180 articles, the author and editor of numerous reference works, and an expert in endophytes, microbes that inhabit the internal tissues of plants without causing disease. The conversation that we'll be having is about plants, but it's also about soil, the subject of a recent series of blogs on our website, gonaturaleducation.info. We invite you to check them out. James White, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
James, some of our folks who are listening are students, and some of these students are evaluating different careers or are just interested generally in the natural environment. So they're wondering, as am I, what does a plant biologist do? Would you please explain?
Yes. Well, plant biologists, also called plant scientists, by the way, study plants, all aspects of plants, really. They'll study physiology of plants and how plants work internally. Plant biologists will study things like photosynthesis, or in my case, we study endophytes. And these are microbes that go into plants. And so really anything that has to do with the biology of a plant is what plant biologists study.
Excellent. At the top of the podcast, the definition that I gave of endophytes was very basic. Would you please explain what they are and how they relate not just to plants, but to the soil?
Yes. All plants have endophytes. And what these endophytes are, I'll first define the term. Endo means internal, phyte means plant. These are basically microbes that plants take into their tissues. And many of these endophytes are actually start out as soil microbes, and they're absorbed into the plant through the roots, typically. And the plant uses them to get nutrients and uses them to become more stress tolerant and hardier. Because these are soil microbes, they often will carry nutrients from the soil into the plant when the plants absorb these microbes from the soil.
Got it. So many folks who spend some time in the garden are familiar with the back of a fertilizer package and nitrogen and potassium, but plants need a lot of different nutrients. What are some of the things that they need?
Well, they need both macronutrients, which are the nutrients, the NPK that you see on your fertilizer, and calcium and some other very important nutrients that plants need in large quantities. But there also are micronutrients, and these micronutrients, things like molybdenum and iron, manganese, zinc, the metals. Plants really have to have the macronutrients to construct much of what their structure is made of, but these micronutrients are actually, they need them in smaller quantities, but they need them to run their enzymes, really, because their enzymes have little components to them, metallic components called cofactors. And so they have to get those metals and those micronutrients for those to make their enzymes work, basically.
Got it. Do the macro and macronutrients and micronutrients refer to the size? And if so, how small are these particles?
Well, it's not the size that the macro and the micro refers to. It's the amount, right? It's the amount. So the macronutrients are needed in higher quantities than the micronutrients that are needed in just tiny quantities. But just because it's a tiny quantity doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, you can't do, for example, photosynthesis if you don't have magnesium and iron and some other micronutrients. You just need it in small quantities. But if you can't get it, you can't even do photosynthesis. So these micronutrients, and the other thing is, oftentimes these micronutrients are hard to get. They're hard to get. So plants will often use the endophytes to get these micronutrients. They also use them to get macronutrients, but micronutrients are especially important for endophytes.
Do plants have I guess the word is symbiotic relationship with endophytes? Do they give endophytes anything back? Is there an exchange of any type?
They do actually, and I have not. Well, they give to the endophytes. They'll cultivate the endophytes. They'll give them some carbon, right, from photosynthesis, and then they'll frequently will take the nutrients from them, and in smaller quantities. So it's an exchange. What do the microbes get? The microbes get replicated. They get a home. They deliver nutrients, and in some cases they're degraded by the plant. But I haven't mentioned this. I don't know, Steve, if you were planning to get to it, but there's another process that involves endophytes, and this is a process called rhizophagy cycle. It's a rhizophagy cycle. Rhizo for root, phagy for eating, and basically it's the root eating cycle. And what this involves is where roots that go into the soil will actually secrete exudates, we call it, but they're sugars and they're organic acids, and there also may be some amino acids and some other nutrients that they secrete at the root tips out into the soil. And these are actually attractants for microbes, and the microbes can detect these nutrients that roots are secreting, and then they swim to the root tip and or otherwise get to the root tip, because that's a source of food. So they get to that root tip, and then when they're at the root tip, the plant will actually absorb the microbes into the root cells at the tip. They'll take them into the cells, and then they will secrete or expose the microbes to superoxide. And this is a highly potent form of reactive oxygen. Oxygen is actually a powerful oxidant, right? Mm-hmm. And superoxide is an especially powerful oxidant, and that will oxidize the cell walls off of the bacteria. They get absorbed into the root cell, take their cell walls off, and make these bacteria, make them into protoplasts. And the reactive oxygen effectively extracts nutrients from these microbes, and then the microbes are replicated in the root cells, and then they especially in the root hairs, and then they are ejected. They stimulate growth of the root hairs, and then as those root hairs grow, they're ejected from the tips of the root hairs. And so every time there is a little growth spurt in the root hair, some bacteria are ejected out of it. And so you have continual growth spurts as those root hairs elongate. And with each growth spurt, you get more bacteria ejected back into the soil from the tips of those root hairs. The bacteria will then reform their cell walls once they're ejected out of the tip of the root hair, reform their cell walls, and then go swimming back out into the soil to get more nutrients, later on to be attracted back to the root tip. And that's the cycle part of the rhizophagy cycle. So plants just keep doing this, cycling these microbes back to the soil, then attract them back inside the plant as an endophyte from the root tip, extracting nutrients from them and ejecting them back out of the root hairs, like that. Continual cycle, continual, kind of like a little machine, farming these microbes in the soil to get nutrients from them. Wow. It's a fantastic process.
It is. Are there things that can interrupt it? And I mean in a bad way. For example, are there human activities that interrupt this cycle? And if so, what are some of the consequences?
Well, it's if we, for example, sterilize soils or damage soils so that we don't have good microbiology in the soils, if we're doing deep turning of soils, If we're using sterilants, sometimes people sterilize soil to kill nematodes or some other kind of soil pathogens. Well, that has a non-target effect where it hurts all the microbes, right? And then you've messed up your soil, and you messed up the soil health, messed up your soil biology. Plants can't get the microbes from the soil. They can't use those microbes to get nutrients because they're just not there. Some of the microbes go in seeds. So if you sterilize seeds, you're killing important microbes. The mother plant, the parental plant that actually puts on seeds microbes that the seedling needs in order to grow. So if you sterilize those seeds, if you kill those microbes, the seedlings won't grow well initially, and they'll also be more susceptible to disease and some other issues without their microbes, less stress hardy and so forth. If you remove all the microbes, what you do is you addict plants to chemical fertilizer, because otherwise you can't grow them if you have no microbes there. They really need those microbes. Plants in nature don't need our fertilizers. They are perfectly well on their own with their microbes.
Wow. So what about manure? Because that's something we have written about and covered at Go Natural Education a bit. Is it a good source of nutrients for plants, especially compared to the chemical options that are available?
It really is. It's a good source of nutrients. The manure, you do have to be a little bit careful with manure in that green manure, if it's too microbial rich, you overwhelm a plant, and that slows it down. The plant can take in so many microbes, but when you have so many microbes there, an overabundance of microbes coming out of green manure, for example, it's could be an issue. It'll slow your plant. It doesn't hurt your plant, but it slows down growth for a little while the plant is getting adapted to it. So, but under normal circumstances, if you treat that manure, age it a little bit before you put it on, then you're perfectly fine, and plants love it. It has plenty of microbes for the plant. There's
Sure.
no overwhelming. Plants grow much better.
Excellent. One last question for you about soil and endophytes. I read recently, although the research wasn't recent, that endophytes can be used in bioremediation to remove contaminants from soil. Is that accurate? And is there anything to report on that front?
Well, the reason that endophytes can be used for bioremediation is because of the increased hardiness of plants. Okay, so under circumstances where plants don't have as many endophytes, say you're using a typically cultivated plant where endophytes have been lost, the plants are not hardy. And so they won't grow in the certain contaminated soils, heavy lead, for example, lead or, other kinds of contaminants as well. But when an endophyte is present, plants become tolerant to stress. They become oxidatively stress tolerant, and that enables them to grow in those soils. And because they're able to grow in those contaminated soils, they will absorb more of the contaminants into the tissues, and then they can be removed. Cut the plant material and remove it to a different site, and essentially clean out the soils. The other thing that's happening is, at least with some contaminants, is that they will break down with reactive oxygen, and because the endophytes in plants and plant cells have an oxidative interaction, the plants are oxidizing the microbes, and what happens is that reactive oxygen will also break down certain kinds of contaminants, so there actually will reduce the contaminants themselves. So two mechanisms really. The main one is the increased hardiness of plants, which allows them to grow in the contaminated site and absorb those toxins.
Fascinating stuff. James White, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
You're so welcome.